Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with part 14, amid the dust of the ages of a long civilization's trail, an account of recent experiences in mystic places and strange lands by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC, an article taken from Rosicrucian Digest, volume 16, number 5, June 1938. Along Civilization's Trail by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. Editor's note. This is the 14th episode of a narrative by the Supreme Secretary relating the experiences he and his party had in visiting mystic shrines and places in Europe and the ancient world. Amid the dust of the ages. The pavement had ended nearly an hour ago. Baghdad was no longer in sight. Riding, even though in a modern car, was an exertion rather than a pleasure, and we were thrown violently from one side to another as the car attempted to negotiate the ruts that served as a road. The actual distance from Baghdad to the ancient site of Babylon is but 60 miles, but it requires nearly 3 hours to make the journey. Though it was only 10 o'clock a.m., the sun had already become uncomfortably warm, and the powder-like dust of the plain over which we traveled, churned by the wheels of the car, choked and irritated our throats and eyes. We had left the Tigris River and were heading westward toward its twin, the Euphrates, on whose banks the city of Babylon was originally located. With the waters of the Tigris, we left behind us all vegetation, all vestiges of life, even color. Before us was a flat terrain covered everywhere with the whitish dust. It was strange to say, not desert-like in appearance, not like a land that had always been barren, but like a place that had been laid to waste. I thought of it as some vigorous being that had been trapped and, after life had ebbed from its form, had gradually crumbled until its impalpable parts, flung free, had settled down on all things around. In my imagination, I visualized that a deluge of water here would cause not only a cohesion of these dust particles, but a magical reassembly and restoration of the magnificent forms that once composed the civilization of this region. The stillness, when we stopped for a few moments, was appalling and hung heavy about us. We felt as though we were shut within a glass sphere which the slightest sound might shatter, permitting the inrush of strange cries, freakish laughter, and the wails of the millions who had lived and died here centuries ago. Ominous as the quiet was, we contributed to it by not speaking, because the human voice sounded unnatural, even hideous, like a cry from the depths of a cavern. I was not unmindful of the predictions of the Hebrew prophets taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar when he destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC, that the splendor and glory of Babylon would so crumble that future man, looking at its utter desolation and ruin, would marvel that such a place could have ever been a site of power and beauty. It truly was as though the land had been visited by the wrath of a god. We were not alone in our feelings, for our native porter and driver was strangely quiet as well. He seemed to have a reluctance to reach our destination quickly, and even when the roadway permitted, he did not accelerate the car speed. Was there, I wondered, any connection between this combination of sentiments which we had about the land and the difficulty we had experienced in engaging a porter for the journey? Rising suddenly into view about a mile to our right were a series of mounds. At this distance, they never would have attracted the attention of tourists or casual travelers, but to us who knew of their existence, they were the remains of Babylon which we sought. Babylon was of little importance before the 3rd millennium BC. In fact, its prominence came with Hammurabi's rise to power, and when it became the capital of Babylonia, it dominated this whole surrounding land. Babylon owed its importance to 3 conditions, namely geographical, political, and spiritual. Preceding Babylon in importance was the city of Kish, not far distant, located on the banks of the Euphrates at that time. Later, the river changed its course away from Kish to Babylon, and because of this, Babylon acquired suzerainty of the entire land. At this point, but a narrow stretch of land separates the 2 big rivers of the valley, the Tigris and the Euphrates. To the north originally was the great fertile area of the Tigris, and to the south, the wide plain that borders on the Persian Gulf. Travel centuries ago, as now, was best along the river edges in the valley proper. This forced all traffic through Babylon in the middle and gave Babylon her dominant political position. The third factor, or the spiritual one, was the city religion of Babylon. The principal god of Babylon was Marduk. The people had personal pride in him, and desired that he be given priority over the other gods of the entire country and its surrounding nations. Even kings and princes were forced to submit to the rites of respect to this god, which amounted nearly to their coronation by the priesthood. No ventures or activities were permitted which were not done in the name of this god. For a great time, this religious influence bound all contemporary life closely with Babylon and made her a religious Mecca, as well as a place of commercial importance. This religious supremacy was made possible mainly by fear. When any prominent person who had not recognized Marduk or his priesthood suffered a calamity, the priesthood attributed the misfortune to a punishment by the god. When the Assyrian king, Sennacherib, who leveled Babylon in his siege of that city in the 6th century BC, died, his death was said by the priesthood to have been caused by his failure to pay homage to their god, Marduk. We had come to an abrupt stop at the foot of one of these mounds, which were about 25 feet in height. And now that we were close to them, we observed that they were about 100 yards in length and 50 yards across. Viewing them from where we stood, they seemed to be a natural formation, certainly not man-made. Actually, these mounds, covered by debris and the dust of the centuries, were the remains of the palaces, walls, canals, temples, and towers of Babylon and later civilizations. We struggled up the steep sides of one, lugging our heavy camera equipment and sneezing with the dust raised by our feet, which broke through the surface crust, baked by the sun. We perspired little, for the air, as in Egypt, was exceedingly dry and absorbed the moisture as it appeared. The sun's rays were now fierce. Their burning effect on our exposed skin was like that of drawing a sharp blade across the flesh, smarting and stinging. From our elevation, the whole plain for miles around was revealed. To our west, some distance from these ruins, was a fringe of green grass and palms stretching in a straight line nearly north and south as far as the eye could see. This growth marked the banks of the Euphrates River. Its course in ancient times ran close to these mounds and fed the canals of the ancient city. The brilliance and varied shades of green of the vegetation caused us to realize how magnificent the gardens and surrounding terrain must have been during the glory of Babylon when she was queen of the ancient world. After she was demolished by Sennacherib, Nebuchadnezzar in 604 to 561 BC returned from his destruction of Jerusalem to restore Babylon's splendor and the temples of her revered gods. There before us, like a refuse heap, lay part of his handiwork, the ruins of his great palace. It looked like a crater caused by the explosion of a great shell, for it was merely a large, ugly hole. It must have been 200 feet square. From where we stood, it looked as though heaped high in the center was a mass of rock or chunks of dried soil. Adjoining this large crater were smaller ones, subdivided with partially upright partitions or walls. These were the remains of the same structure and parts of others. Towering above all to the right, the largest structure still standing in Babylon was the Ishtar Gate. The remains are two square-like towers of mud brick, once faced with splendidly glazed and colored tile and ornamented with figures of animals, a few of which are still visible. See photograph, February 1937, issue of the Rosicrucian Digest. Nebuchadnezzar had married a Median princess, so the legends tell us, of extreme beauty and culture, whom he greatly loved. He brought her from her mountainous and beautiful home country of Persia to the flat, dusty, and ugly land of Babylonia. He set about rebuilding Babylon, and he constructed great walls of defense, one within the other, making it the greatest fortified city of antiquity. Meanwhile, his beautiful bride pined for the beauty of the mountains of her homeland with their fragrant shrubs, flowers, and refreshing verdure. Learning of her loneliness, it is recounted that he decided to build her an artificial mountain on which she could dwell. Thus was begun his great palace, which became one of the 7 wonders of the world, which we refer to as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The structure, as most of them in Babylon and Assyria, was built of mud brick and then fired to compose a tile or faience. It was built in tiers, each slightly recessed, so that the whole composed an enormous terraced tower. And along each terrace were planted magnificent trees and tropical plants and vines which hung low on the sides, causing it to be known as the Hanging Gardens. At the top of the tower was the palace and living quarters of Nebuchadnezzar and his bride. He had the waters of the Euphrates diverted into great canals around the palace base, and on either side of them were magnificent tiled walks, and in them artistic boats leisurely floated, carrying musicians and men and women of his court. The Great Ishtar Gate was built to commemorate the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, a composite of all the female Babylonian goddesses. She was a deity of nature and beauty, also known as the Weeping Mother, because it was thought that she interceded in behalf of man whenever he was to be punished severely for his sins against Marduk. A planet was named after her, and it is thought it was the same one which the Greeks later called Venus. In fact, authorities believe Venus was the Grecian counterpart of Ishtar. From this gateway to his palace, Nebuchadnezzar built a roadway which became known as the Sacred Way. Along it, at the New Year festival in March, a processional carried an image of Marduk. After homage was paid to him at the numerous temples, he was then placed on the river barge and conveyed to the northern section of the city. Through this gateway, which we carefully photographed, had marched the conquering army of the Xerxes and later Cyrus, who successfully in the 6th century BC routed the combined Lydian, Babylonian and Egyptian forces which opposed him. Also through this gateway tramped the legions of Darius, Cyrus's successor. Darius, admiring the beauty and culture of the city, attempted to preserve it. We endeavored to persuade our porter to climb among these ruins with us. We offered him an additional fee to carry the camera equipment. He refused. Fearing that if we insisted too strongly he might leave entirely, we desisted and slid with an avalanche of dust and hard particles following us down into the center of the demolished Nebuchadnezzar's palace. The surface blocks in the piles about us were just mud bricks, several of them still adhering to each other and slowly returning to the dust from which they were made, and they received little attention from us. Slowly we began the laborious business of digging deeper in the thousands of years-old rubbish about us for what might have been left or overlooked by the German archaeological expeditions of 1914 and earlier which had worked here. Since the World War, no real attempt had been made to continue the great excavation work in Babylon begun by the Germans. The Iraqian government, which controls the ruins, discouraged further excavations, not by its attitude or by actual prohibition, but because of the instability of the government. An expedition might obtain a permit from the present government to excavate extensively and establish a research base at the site of the ruins, with thousands of dollars worth of equipment, work diligently for several years and recover much valuable material. And then suddenly a government upset occur, and the succeeding authorities prohibit the excavators from continuing or from removing the fruits of their labors, or might even, as has been done elsewhere, give the materials which they recovered to some other institution or country. We worked diligently, our thoughts occupied not with what we now saw before us, but with a mental picture of this site in ancient days, the days of its magnificence. We thought of the great engineering skill of these people, how they had driven into the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers piles to enlarge their land, how they had built beautiful parks laid out in geometrical designs. We thought of the splendid gold work which they accomplished, of the gorgeous jewelry and furnishings with which the palaces were amply supplied, of swimming pools, race courses, fields of grain and vegetables, herds of cattle and sheep. We also thought of the Hammurabi Code of Laws, with its excellent system for courts and judges, its protection of the person and of property rights, with its sound provisions for divorce, its regulation of taxes, and of the stern punishment it meted out. We thought of the temple liturgies, the chanting and singing, the wailing and prayers. A cry from Frater Brouwer brought me to his side. He had found the first of what we had hoped to find, a large mud brick, a building block about a foot square inscribed in cuneiform, the peculiar wedge-like writing of the Babylonians and Assyrians. As we held it in our hands, we diligently and reverently examined it. Nearly 4,000 years ago, some human like ourselves, a craftsman, had carefully written this inscription with his reed stylus in preparation for including this block with thousands of others in the walls of the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. What was he like, this ancient craftsman? What was his life? And what did he think of the future, 4,000 years hence? Could he have imagined a people from a very distant land like ourselves examining his handiwork centuries after his death? From the time the workmen cemented this block in place, using the natural soil until now, when we lifted it from the dust into which it fell, it is very probable that no other hand had ever touched it. We were at this moment living in another world, seeing and feeling things which represented life and power to another people that seemed as much a part of a continuous existence to them as the things of our world do to us. Around the ancient maker of this block, the writer of this inscription, had been such activity, such examples of strength, that is, buildings, temples, troops, broad avenues, teeming thousands of humans, that although he could have imagined changes, a state of such utter desolation, oblivion, nothingness into which his civilization eventually fell would have been beyond his thought, as far beyond it as is a similar thought to the mind of the average resident of cities like New York, London, and Paris. Time had made the impossible possible. It had vanquished all, and we very forcefully realized that it could do so again with the powerful civilizations now in existence. It is surges of thought such as we now experienced, stirring emotions such as those we now felt, that have led archaeologists to the far corners of the earth to wrest from the past the story of men of other times. Here then was another example of universal brotherhood, but universal in time as well as extent. In archaeology, we find a love of not only those who work, play, and pray today throughout the world, but a sympathetic understanding of the human race since it began, and a desire to bind the past fast to the present. The archaeologist has a pride in all human achievement. He believes, and rightly so, that we have as much right to share the experiences of our fellow men of thousands of years ago as we do those of today who are thousands of miles distant from us. After all, no experience is personal unless we participate in it. Thus, what others have done before us can be as interesting and as intimate to us as those experiences of our foreign contemporaries which we seek to know through our news channels. In the broader sense, humanity has no periods. It is a continuous flow from its beginning to its ultimate end. Only when we confine ourselves to a consideration of the things of our individual lives do we get that narrow concept of humanity as having periods or eras and assign them a relative importance to our own day. If we think the Egyptian and Babylonian vain and lacking in forethought because he concerned himself so fully with only the things of his own period, then, in light of what time has since done to his civilization, let us not make the same mistake of occupying ourselves solely with the things of the present time. To us belongs a consciousness of thousands of years of human endeavor, not just of the meager span of the few years that compose our individual lives. If we live in the past as well as in the present, we can live 10,000 years in one lifetime. In other words, life begins not with our infancy, but with the earliest birth of humanity of which we have record. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.